I thought I was healing. I thought I was rebuilding my life after loss, but instead, I crossed a line I can never uncross. I betrayed trust, memory, and every shred of dignity I had left. I let desire blur into delusion. I let myself believe comfort was love. And now? I disgust myself. I feel used. I feel weak. I let a moment of vulnerability rewrite my morality, and I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. After a day wrapped in courtroom tension and the sterile hum of overhead lights, I stepped out into the sharp, wind-laced evening of downtown Chicago. The city buzzed with urgency, horns blaring on Wacker Drive, footsteps echoing in the canyons of steel and glass, the L train rumbling above like a restless beast. But all I wanted was stillness. My high-rise apartment on the near north side, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and soft minimalist design, waited like an old friend. The lobby's polished marble and subtle scent of citrus offered a brief comfort. I took the elevator to the 23rd floor. The silence there more profound than any courtroom pause. Inside, lavender drifted from a dish near the door, and I felt my body begin to relax, until I saw the soft flicker of the TV. Timber was home, but it wasn't just the fact of him being there, it was what he was watching. The screen glowed with a frozen image I recognized instantly. Me, a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. One of the videos, intimate, private, sacred. My breath caught. Timber turned slowly, eyes wide with something I couldn't yet name. And that's when the silence broke. I stood there, frozen. The door closed behind me. The echo of the click louder than anything else in the room. The screen was dark now, but it didn't matter. The silence between us was full of what had already been seen, too much. Too intimate. I could still feel the ghost of that version of myself flickering in the air, the silk robe, the candlelight, the way I had moved as if the world belonged to no one but me and the man I loved. "I'm sorry," Timber said again, his voice cracking slightly. I walked slowly toward the living room. Not angry, not even shocked, just disoriented, like I had stumbled into an old dream and couldn't tell if I was still asleep. "You shouldn't have watched that," I said, not a rebuke, just the truth. "I didn't mean to, I swear. I was looking for a different file." It just started. His hands were fidgeting in his lap, his entire posture stiff, like a child waiting to be scolded. But when I realized it was you, I couldn't stop. That part landed differently. I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't avoiding my gaze now. In fact, he was holding it, not with defiance, but with something more vulnerable. Something I couldn't yet name. "You saw something you weren't meant to see," I said. "I know," he said quickly, "but it didn't feel wrong. I mean, it did. But not for the reasons you think. It didn't feel dirty. It felt like seeing you. Not the Sarah who makes coffee in the morning and reminds me to check the mail. But the woman my father fell in love with." I didn't know how to respond to that. The woman in that video, she had existed. Fully, unapologetically. She had danced for love. She had whispered secrets to a camera because her husband had been too weak to touch her. And she wanted him to remember that she was still here. Still his. But that woman had also disappeared. Or maybe I'd hidden her. "I haven't looked at those videos in years," I said softly, sitting down across from him. "Why not?" he asked. "Because watching them hurts. Because they remind me of the version of myself I lost when he died." Timber nodded slowly. "I think I understand that. But seeing her made me realize how much of you is still here." That made my chest tighten. I didn't want to feel seen. Not like this. Not by him. But I did. And that truth settled between us. Quiet and undeniable. He stood slowly. "I'll give you some space." He walked toward his room, pausing at the hallway. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am. I just didn't expect to feel so much." Neither did I. As the door to his room closed, I stayed there on the couch, wrapped in silence and something that felt dangerously close to awakening. The apartment was quiet again, but not in the comforting way it had been earlier. Now the silence pressed in, too thick, too knowing. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the blank screen, but all I could see was the memory of myself, moving, smiling, offering everything I had to a man I thought would always be there. My skin still tingled from the encounter. though no one had touched me. Not really. I reached for the remote. Hesitated, then opened the folder again. My fingers hovered over the thumbnails. I knew each one by heart, though it had been years since I'd allowed myself to watch. My breath caught as I selected the second video. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because it had always been my favorite. The most vulnerable, the most honest. The screen lit up, and there I was again, draped in soft, sheer fabric, kneeling on the edge of the bed, speaking softly to the camera. I spoke to my husband like he was in the room. I remembered what I'd said, how I missed the weight of his hands. How I needed to be seen, needed to feel, and as I watched, I felt it again. The ache, the longing, but this time it was layered with something else, confusion. Maybe, or the sharp, disorienting awareness that someone else had seen this version of me. Not a stranger, not someone who would forget. Timber had seen her, and what haunted me wasn't the exposure, it was that he hadn't looked away. A soft knock interrupted my spiral. I turned toward the sound. Timber stood in the hallway, half in shadow, barefoot in a t-shirt and sweats. He looked hesitant but not ashamed. I couldn't sleep, he said. I thought, maybe you couldn't either. I should have sent him back to bed. I should have stood, closed the laptop, turned off the lights, but instead, I said, come here. He approached slowly, unsure. I didn't move. The video was still playing, muted now, flickering gently across the screen. He sat beside me, our shoulders almost touched. His gaze flicked to the screen and then back to me. That's the version of you I saw, he said quietly, and I haven't stopped thinking about her. I turned toward him, my pulse rising. That version of me only existed in the dark. I replied, for one person, and maybe she still exists. He said, maybe she just needs someone to believe she's still there. His voice was low, but it vibrated inside me. He reached out, slowly, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The contact was soft, deliberate. My body reacted before my mind could. The rush of heat, the rise of breath, desire. Yes, but also recognition. I didn't pull away, because somewhere beneath the ache, I wanted to be remembered. And worse, part of me wanted to be seen like that again. Even if it was by him. He sat beside me, the muted video casting flickering shadows across our faces. I felt the warmth of Timber's body before I felt his touch, his presence humming beside me like static before a storm. The version of me on the screen smiled again, whispered something soft I didn't need sound to remember. I'd said it for a man who was no longer here. But now that moment lived again in front of someone else. Timber turned his head slowly toward me, and our eyes met. There was something raw in his gaze, an ache, an awe, something dangerously close to reverence. I don't know if this is right, he whispered, but I know I can't pretend it isn't real. The air between us felt thinner now, more fragile. My breath hitched as he leaned in, not fast, not demanding, just close enough for me to feel the warmth of him brush my cheek. His fingers hovered at my jaw, and I could tell he was waiting for a sign, permission, or resistance. I didn't move. His hand slid to the back of my neck, gentle but firm, like he was trying to memorize the shape of trust. Then he kissed me. It was not the kiss of a boy. It was the kiss of someone discovering the edge of something he didn't know how to name. He kissed me like it mattered, like this wasn't just want, but need, and maybe it was. Maybe that was what scared me more than anything. I responded before I had time to think. My lips parted under his. Slow and searching, I let myself fall into the moment, into the heat that uncoiled deep in my stomach, into the forgotten sensation of being wanted for no reason other than being. Timber pulled back slightly, breathing hard, eyes dark. Tell me to stop, he said. I couldn't. Instead, I cupped his face, my thumb brushing the corner of his mouth. This can't be impulsive. If we cross this line, we don't come back the same. I know, he said, but I've never felt more sure of anything. That kind of certainty, so youthful, so absolute, might have once made me laugh. But tonight, it made me ache. I guided his hand to the sash of my robe. My pulse thundered in my ears as he untied it slowly. With trembling fingers, never breaking our gaze, the fabric slipped open, and his breath caught, not from lust, but from wonder. You're beautiful, he murmured, as if the words were a prayer. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to my shoulder. Then my collarbone, each touch slow. reverent, electric. My hands slid under his shirt, feeling the heat of his skin, the tension in his muscles. He was nervous, eager, honest, and in that vulnerability, something in me broke open. Not in shame, but in surrender. Because in his arms, I felt seen, not as a memory, or a widow, or a woman aging quietly in the shadows, but as something living, desired, awake. He kissed me again, slower this time, less urgent, more assured, like he had felt the shift in me, the subtle surrender. My hands slid over his shoulders, feeling the tension in him, the restraint he was barely holding onto. The robe slipped from my body completely now, pooling around my hips. Timber's breath caught as he looked at me, really looked, not just with the wonder of a young man discovering a woman's body, but with the reverence of someone aware of what he was being trusted with. "You're breathtaking," he murmured, as if the words came out before he had time to censor them. I should have felt self-conscious. The years had left their marks, soft lines at the corners of my eyes. Gentle evidence of time's quiet erosion. But under Timber's gaze, I felt none of that. His wonder wasn't performative, it was real, unfiltered. His hands moved to my waist, slow and hesitant. His touch was warm, delicate, almost reverent, as he traced the curve of my sides, the dip of my back. I closed my eyes and leaned into the sensation, letting go of the ache that had lived beneath my skin for years. I guided him gently, pulling his shirt over his head and tossing it aside. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with mine. When I ran my fingers down his skin, he shivered, not from cold, but from anticipation. We sank onto the bed together, tangled in linen and something far more dangerous, emotional need. He kissed my neck, then lower, leaving a trail of heat down my body. His lips trembled against my skin, unsure but eager. I felt his nervousness, not as a flaw, but as a kind of purity. He wasn't pretending, he wasn't trying to impress. He was discovering. And I let him. With every breath, every hesitant touch, I felt more than arousal. I felt reborn, not as the woman I once was, but as the woman I had forgotten I could still be, soft. Alive, aching for closeness not born of habit or obligation, but of choice. His hand slid between my thighs, and I gasped, more from the emotional jolt than the physical one. He paused, uncertain. "You're okay?" he whispered. His voice low, ragged. "Yes," I said, "more than okay." I guided him, gently, patiently, and when we finally came together, it was not frenzied or wild, it was slow, deep, intense. His body moved with mine, unsure at first, but gradually finding rhythm. We held each other like it was the only thing keeping us from disappearing entirely. After, we lay tangled in silence, his head on my chest, his fingers tracing patterns over my stomach. I ran my hand through his hair, neither of us speaking, because there were no words for what we'd just shared. Only breath, only warmth, only the echo of a line we could never uncross. And neither of us wanted to. The morning light slipped across the bed in thin gold ribbons, warming the sheets, softening the shadows. I stirred first, still tangled in Timber's arms. His body was pressed against mine, one hand resting over my stomach like it had always belonged there. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to chase the fragile spell away. But my eyes were open, and the moment had already begun to shift, no longer the dark intimacy of the night before, but the quiet weight of morning after. I could still feel his touch on my skin, gentle, unhurried, filled with curiosity and awe. The way he had looked at me as he moved inside me, like I was not just a woman, but a revelation, still echoed through my bones. He had made no demands. He had asked for nothing. But his touch had spoken volumes. A part of me wanted to roll away, to wrap myself in the robe and reassemble the walls I'd so carelessly lowered. But another part, the part he'd uncovered, wanted to stay wrapped in his arms. To savor the warmth, the connection, the sense of being wanted not for memory, but for now. Timber stirred behind me. His breath brushed against my shoulder as he whispered, "Are you awake?" I nodded. He tightened his hold slightly, pulling me closer. "I keep thinking I dreamed it." "You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" That question settled heavily between us. I turned to face him, brushing my fingers gently through his hair. His eyes were vulnerable, a storm of worry beneath the surface. "No," I said honestly, "I don't." His relief was palpable. He leaned in and kissed me softly, slowly, with none of the uncertainty from the night before. His confidence was still new, raw and tentative, but it was growing, shaped by the trust we had shared in the dark. His hand found the curve of my hip, sliding along the sheet. The kiss deepened, heat stirring again between us like an ember catching wind. I felt myself responding, my body remembering what it was to be touched without hesitation, without fear. We moved together again, slower this time, more aware. It wasn't about urgency, it was about presence, about savoring what we had crossed into. His hands explored my body with more certainty, more reverence, like he had discovered something sacred and now worshipped it in whispers and breath. When it was over, we lay in the hush of the morning, sweat cooling on our skin, the world still wrapped in that in-between light where nothing outside seemed to exist. But I knew the moment wouldn't last. The day would begin, life would knock, and the world we'd created here, beneath these sheets, would have to hide again. For now, though, I let myself believe in it, even if it couldn't last forever. Blank, blank. The day unfolded slowly, as if the world outside sensed what had shifted between us and didn't dare intrude. We moved through the apartment in silence, not out of awkwardness, but from something deeper, a kind of sacred caution. We had crossed a line, and now we were waiting to feel what came next. Timber sat at the kitchen island, barefoot, shirtless, drinking coffee like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. I stood at the counter across from him, watching the steam rise from my own cup. I didn't speak, I didn't know how to. But the tension between us wasn't fear. It was intensity, like a held breath, a current under the surface. Every glance felt heavier now. Every movement carried meaning. We hadn't just shared a night. We'd opened something. He looked up at me. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," I said. "About last night?" I nodded. He set down his mug and stood slowly, walking around the island until he was right in front of me. He didn't reach for me, just stood close, letting the silence speak first. "I don't regret it," he said, voice low. "I need you to know that." "I don't either," I replied, "but that doesn't make it simple." "No," he agreed. "It makes it more real." His hand reached out, finally, brushing against my arm, just a touch, but it set my skin alight. My body remembered him, the way he'd held me, the way he'd looked at me like I was something rare, something untouchable, until I invited him closer. "Do you feel different?" he asked, eyes searching mine. I inhaled, held it, yes, and no. He stepped closer. "I feel like I've crossed into something I don't want to leave." His words stirred something sharp in me, desire. Yes, but also fear, not of him, of what this could become, of how deep I might let it go. "I don't know what this is yet," I said. He nodded. "Then let's find out, slowly, but together." He leaned in, and this time when he kissed me, it wasn't gentle, it was claiming, not in possession, but in understanding. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, my back pressing to the edge of the counter. My coffee mug trembled beside me as his mouth moved against mine. "Open, hungry," I responded, letting myself feel it, letting myself fall again. Because this time, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision. When we finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. I didn't, because whatever we were becoming, it had already begun. And stopping now would only hurt more than whatever came next. The rest of the day moved around us like a shadow, slow, quiet, and slightly off balance. Timber and I went about our routines as if something fragile hadn't broken open between us. But every glance we exchanged, every moment our fingers brushed too long, reminded us that things were no longer simple. They couldn't be. By late afternoon, I found myself in my study, pretending to read over case notes I'd read a dozen times already. I needed to work, I needed to feel normal. But even the words on the page looked different now. Dimmer, further away. A soft knock on the doorframe pulled me from my haze. Timber stood there, barefoot again, a book in hand. But he wasn't reading, he was watching me. "Can I come in?" I nodded, setting the papers aside. "Of course." He crossed the room slowly and sat across from me, book in his lap, unread. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice quiet. I don't want this to become something we regret. It's already something complicated, I replied, and complicated things usually carry risk. I know, he said, but it doesn't feel wrong. Not when we're together. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. It doesn't feel wrong in the moment. It feels real, and that's the part that scares me. He nodded, understanding in his eyes, because if it's real, it can fall apart. I looked at him, this man who had once been a boy I worried about in the backseat of my car. Who had become someone I now shared secrets and skin with. It was dizzying, beautiful, terrifying. I don't know how to define this. I said, what we're doing, or what we are. Maybe we don't need to define it right now. Timber said, maybe we just let it be what it is and promise to be honest with each other. His words settled into me like warmth. Simple, but dangerous in their simplicity. Because honesty meant vulnerability, and vulnerability, with someone who saw too much, could burn. Still, I nodded. Okay, honesty. He smiled gently, then rose from the chair and crossed to me. He bent down, kissed my forehead softly, nothing heated, nothing seductive, just a quiet expression of care. A moment of us. As he turned to leave, I stopped him. Timber? He looked back. I don't know where this ends. Neither do I, he said. But I know I'm not ready for it to. The door clicked softly behind him. And I sat there in the hush of the evening, heart full of questions, body still humming with memory. For now, we were still safe in the space between discovery and consequence. But I knew it couldn't last. Something would give, and when it did, we'd either have to step forward into the unknown, or lose each other to the weight of what we were never supposed to be. The days that followed unfolded in careful rhythms, shared breakfasts, quiet conversations, the gentle brushing of hands as we passed one another in the narrow hallway. We didn't talk about what we were doing, not directly, but it lingered in the air between us, like heat after lightning, present, undeniable. At night, the lines blurred again. Sometimes we ended up in the same bed. Sometimes we didn't, but every night, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, asking the same question over and over. How long can we keep this contained? Timber was careful with me. Always. Too careful. Almost. As if he understood that I was more fragile than I let on. He didn't press. He didn't push. But I could feel the weight of his restraint. The way his body tensed when I brushed past him too slowly. The way his eyes held mine for just a second too long when I said his name. And yet, I did the same. We were caught in a strange in-between, one part reverent, one part reckless, and it couldn't last forever. On a quiet Thursday morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table, still in my robe, sipping black coffee and pretending to read the news on my tablet. Timber had gone for a walk. He said he needed to clear his head. But I knew better. He was restless. So was I. The front door opened gently. I didn't turn to look. But the voice that followed wasn't his. Sarah? My blood froze. I turned slowly to see Melanie, my colleague, standing in the doorway with a paper bag in her hand and an apologetic smile on her face. I know we said dinner tonight, she said, but I was picking up pastries at Gable's and thought I'd drop some off early. Hope that's okay, your building manager let me in. She stepped inside before I could find words. I forced a smile, setting down my mug. Of course, that's kind of you. Melanie glanced around, casual at first, but then her eyes fell on the second mug across the table. Half full, her gaze shifted. She didn't say anything, but the pause said enough. I didn't know you had company, she said lightly. Think, Sarah, a friend's son, I said smoothly. He's staying for a few days. College break. Ah, she said, setting the bag down. That's nice. Good to have energy in the house. I smiled again, too tightly. She didn't press, but as she left, her eyes lingered a moment too long on the hallway behind me. When the door closed, I exhaled shakily. The cracks had started to form. The world outside was seeping in. Our little cocoon had been pierced. And I realized, we were no longer just navigating each other. We were navigating the risk of being known. Timber returned a few minutes after Melanie left. Hair tousled by wind, cheeks flushed from the cold. He kicked off his shoes and walked into the kitchen, instantly sensing the change in the air. You okay? He asked, studying my face. I didn't answer right away. I just stared down into my coffee. Fingers curled too tightly around the mug. The weight of the morning hadn't left me. Melanie came by, I said finally, unannounced. He froze. What? She brought pastries, said she was in the neighborhood. The building manager let her in. Timber's eyes widened slightly. Did she see anything? She saw 2 mugs, I said, and she saw my face when I realized it wasn't you walking through the door. He came around the island and stood in front of me, voice low. Do you think she knows? I met his gaze. She suspects something, but she doesn't know what. Silence settled in. He looked like he wanted to fix it, to pull me into his arms and promise it would all be fine, but he didn't. Because we both knew this was the moment we had been pretending wouldn't come. The moment when our private world collided with the public one. I didn't plan this, I said. I didn't plan any of it. You were hurting, I was grieving, and somehow we just fell into each other. I know, he said, his voice softer now, but that doesn't make it any less real. He touched my hand. I let him, but the fear had already begun to take root. She's not going to forget what she saw. I murmured, even if she doesn't ask questions now. She will later, and if anyone else finds out. I'm not ashamed of us. He said quickly, not of what we shared. I'm not either, I replied, but that doesn't mean the rest of the world will see it that way. He sat beside me, hands clasped. Then what do we do? End it before it even begins? I sighed. I don't know, because that was the truth. I didn't know how to be in this and still live the life I'd built outside of it. I didn't know how to love him in the shadows without resenting the light. And I didn't know if the cost of keeping our secret would eventually outweigh the connection we were clinging to so tightly. We need to be careful, I said at last, thoughtful, slow. If this means something, then we don't rush into chaos. We protect it. Timber nodded, but I could see the flicker of something in his eyes, hurt. Maybe, or doubt. We sat in silence again, the pastries untouched between us. And I realized something terrifying. This wasn't the end of the secret. It was the beginning of the lie we'd have to live to keep it alive. The next morning, Timber wasn't at the table when I came into the kitchen. No second mug, no soft thud of footsteps or rustle of pages from the couch. Just silence. I found him on the balcony, leaning on the railing, his back tense beneath the gray fabric of his sweater. The city stretched out beyond him, but his eyes weren't on the skyline. They were fixed somewhere far away, somewhere I couldn't reach yet. I stepped outside, wrapping my arms around myself. The air was sharp, the kind of spring chill that pretends it's almost gone but isn't. You're up early, I said quietly. I didn't sleep, he replied without looking at me. I waited, but he didn't say more. Just stood there, still. Eventually, he asked, do you ever wish it had never happened? The question hit harder than I expected. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know the truth, but because I did. No, I said, I don't wish it hadn't happened. I just wish the world didn't make it so hard to figure out what to do now. He nodded, finally glancing at me. I keep thinking about what it would be like if we didn't have to hide. If I could just hold your hand in public, look at you the way I want to, without it being some scandal. I looked at him, truly looked, his expression somewhere between defiant and defeated. He wasn't just craving affection. He was craving recognition, and I couldn't give it to him. Timber, I said gently, this thing between us, it didn't come with a map. We stepped into it because it felt right in the moment. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world will ever understand. Then maybe we don't need the world's approval, he said. Maybe we just need each other. His words were sincere, too sincere. He meant every one of them. But he was still young enough to believe that love, or something like it, could exist in a vacuum. I'm not just worried about people talking, I said. I'm worried about what happens when they start asking questions I can't answer. What happens when you change your mind? When it gets hard, and you realize the cost is more than you expected? You think I'll walk away? I think it would hurt less if you did it now. Before we build something we can't tear down without breaking ourselves. His jaw tightened. So that's it? You want me to leave? No, I whispered. I want you to stay. But I need to know you can live in the shadows with me. At least for now. Because bringing this into the light too soon will destroy it. He was quiet, the wind catching the edge of his sweater. Then, Slowly, he reached for my hand. "I'll stay," he said, "but promise me one thing." "What?" "When we're ready, we won't hide anymore." I nodded, because deep down, I wanted that too, even if I didn't know when, or if, that day would come. For the next week, we lived inside the illusion. We slipped into roles, quiet, careful, invisible to the world. During the day, we acted like housemates. I went to the firm, took calls, nodded through meetings. Timber studied, read, kept to himself. At night, we fell into the quiet gravity of each other again, slow glances, fingertips brushing over backs, whispered words under the hush of moonlight. Our intimacy had taken root in the silence between responsibilities. But even silence carries pressure. It was the little things that began to expose the cracks. The way Timber's eyes lingered too long when I walked into the room. The way my hand paused too naturally on his shoulder. The instinct to say something warm, something real, in front of someone else, only to pull it back just in time. I could feel it wearing on him. And one night, it finally broke the surface. We had finished dinner, the plate still sitting on the table, untouched by conversation. Timber poured us both a glass of wine, his movements stiffer than usual. "I can feel you retreating," he said suddenly. "Every time we get close during the day, you step away." I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the wine, watching the deep red swirl in the glass. "I'm protecting us," I said quietly. "Are you?" His voice had an edge now, not cruel, but hurt. "Or are you protecting yourself?" I met his eyes. They were sharp. But underneath the frustration was that same ache I had seen the first night he looked at me differently. A need not just for touch, but for belonging. "I don't know how to do this in pieces, Sarah," he said. "I'm in this with you, all the way, but sometimes it feels like you're only with me when the door is locked." His words struck something tender, because part of me knew he was right. "I'm scared," I admitted, "of being seen, of what this makes me look like, of losing everything I've built." He nodded. "And I'm scared of being temporary, of being someone you wanted only when you needed to feel alive again." That hit harder than I expected. I crossed the space between us and took his hand, holding it tightly between mine. "You're not temporary," I said, "but we are in something fragile. We can't treat it like it will survive anything if we aren't careful." He looked down at our hands, then up at me again. "So we keep living in the dark?" "For now," I said, "until it's strong enough to survive the light." Timber didn't answer right away, but after a moment, he gave a small nod. "I'll wait," he whispered, "but don't let me wait forever." And in that moment, I knew, what we had wasn't casual. It was becoming something dangerous. Because it was becoming real. 2 nights later, the air in the apartment felt heavier than usual, still, warm, and charged with everything unsaid. We hadn't spoken much since our conversation at the table. Not because we were avoiding each other, but because we were both waiting for something. A shift, a sign, a way forward. I came home late from the office, hair damp from a sudden downpour, files still tucked under my arm like armor. Timber was on the couch, reading. He looked up the moment I stepped in, and something in his face softened. "You look tired," he said. "Long day," I replied, kicking off my shoes. But I didn't go to my room. I didn't retreat. Instead, I walked to him and sat beside him, close enough that our thighs touched. The warmth of him bled into me like heat through fabric. "I've been thinking about what you said," I murmured. He closed the book slowly. "Yeah? I don't want to keep pulling away during the day," I said, "but it's hard. It's like, I'm always measuring everything. My tone, my gaze, even my breath." He reached for my hand and laced his fingers through mine. "Then stop measuring. Just for now. Just here, with me." His words unraveled me. I leaned in and kissed him, deeply, slowly, with the kind of hunger that builds not from impulse, but from waiting. His hand cupped the side of my face, the other moving to my waist, guiding me closer. I climbed into his lap, my knees bracketing his hips, my body settling over his like it belonged there. Because it did. The world outside dissolved. The only thing real was the heat between us, the soft catch of my breath as his lips traced down my neck, the way my hands gripped the back of his shirt like letting go would undo everything. We were still clothed, but barely. Every touch was a promise. Every movement built toward something deeper. And that's when it happened. A knock at the door. We froze. His breath caught. My pulse thundered in my ears. Another knock, firmer this time. Then a voice. Melanie. Sarah? Sorry to drop by again. I brought that case file you mentioned. Thought you might need it for Monday. Timber looked at me, eyes wide, panicked. I scrambled off his lap, grabbed my robe from the chair, and straightened my blouse, heart pounding. Just a second, I called, voice strained. Timber vanished down the hall like smoke, quiet and fast. I opened the door with a practiced smile. Hair still mussed, adrenaline still racing through my veins. Melanie handed me the file, her eyes scanning me, then the couch behind me. You okay? She asked. Too casually. Yeah, I said, gripping the folder like a lifeline. Just got in. Crazy day. She smiled, but her gaze lingered, and I knew she felt it. She didn't know exactly what. But she would soon, because the walls between us and the world? They were starting to crack. This story, though emotionally charged and fictional, reflects the complexity of human desire, grief, and emotional need, especially in moments of vulnerability. In today's world, where relationships are often rushed or hidden behind screens, it's a reminder to approach connection with honesty, self-awareness, and responsibility. If you're navigating complicated feelings, especially ones born from loss or emotional voids, take time to understand your motivations. Don't let loneliness push you into situations that compromise your values or hurt others. Be patient with yourself, seek clarity before action, and remember, true intimacy begins with truth, not secrecy.